They came as fanatics who believed in the Thousand-Year Reich, but what they witnessed in America's heartland destroyed their ideology more completely than any bullet ever could. This is the shocking true story of how the greatest psychological warfare victory of World War II happened not on battlefields, but in farm fields, factory floors, and small-town Maine streets across America, where German prisoners of war encountered a civilization so advanced, so abundant, and so impossibly powerful, that it shattered everything the Nazi propaganda machine had told them about the weak, decadent Americans. When the first contingent of Afrika Korps prisoners stepped off trains at Camp Shelby, Mississippi in May 1943, sunburned, defiant, still wearing their sand-colored uniforms decorated with Rommel's palm tree insignia, they expected to find the America that Joseph Goebbels had described in countless propaganda broadcasts. A nation of mongrel races torn apart by class warfare, where workers starved while Jewish capitalists hoarded wealth, where the Great Depression had never truly ended, and where industrial production was a desperate bluff inflated by Hollywood fakery and Roosevelt's lies. These men, many still in their early 20s, had survived El Alamein and the brutal Tunisian campaign, and they arrived on American soil with their Nazi convictions largely intact, singing Horst Wessel Lied as they marched from the trains, giving stiff-armed salutes to imaginary Führer portraits, fully expecting to be liberated when Germany inevitably won the war within the next 6 months, because that's what every edition of the Völkischer Beobachter had promised them before they shipped out to Africa. But within 3 months of their arrival, something unprecedented began happening in the administrative files at the Provost Marshal General's office in Washington. Reports from camp commanders across 46 states described a phenomenon that military psychologists had never documented before: mass ideological conversion occurring not through forced indoctrination, but through the simple, devastating act of observation. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Davison, who oversaw the Special Projects Division responsible for monitoring prisoner morale, wrote in a classified August 1943 memo that would remain sealed until 1998. The prisoners are experiencing cognitive shock. They simply cannot reconcile what they're seeing with what they were told to believe, and the contradiction is breaking something fundamental in their worldview. What these German soldiers witnessed during their captivity in America from 1943 to 1946 would transform them from Hitler's warriors into democracy's advocates, and the scale of this transformation remains one of World War II's most remarkable but least known stories, a psychological campaign so effective that former POWs would return to Germany and become the architects of its democratic reconstruction, with men like George Gartner choosing to remain in America illegally for 40 years rather than return to Germany, and Walter Hallstein, who spent time as a POW in American camps, eventually becoming the first president of the European Commission, the very embodiment of the democratic, cooperative Europe that Hitler had sought to destroy. The story begins not with the arrival of prisoners, but with the Geneva Convention agreements that would inadvertently create the conditions for this mass conversion. The United States, determined to maintain the moral high ground and ensure good treatment of American POWs held by Germany, committed to treating German prisoners according to strict international law, which meant housing them in conditions substantially similar to American military personnel, feeding them the same rations as U.S. soldiers, approximately 4,000 calories per day, compared to the 2,000 calories German soldiers were receiving on the Eastern Front by 1943, paying them 80 cents per day in canteen coupons for their labor, the equivalent of German military pay, and most significantly, allowing them to work on American farms and in American factories where they would witness firsthand the industrial and agricultural abundance that would shatter their preconceptions about American weakness. The numbers alone tell a staggering story. Between 1943 and 1946, the United States operated 511 POW camps across the continental United States, from Camp Papago Park in Arizona, where German U-boat crews sweltered in the desert, to Camp Holton in Maine, where prisoners worked the potato harvest alongside French-Canadian farmers, to Camp Concordia in Kansas, where 4,000 Germans lived in a facility that resembled a small German village complete with beer gardens, theatrical productions, and educational programs, housing a total of 371,683 German prisoners at the program's peak in May 1945, along with about 50,000 Italian POWs and 5,000 Japanese POWs, though the Japanese were kept in separate facilities due to concerns about their treatment by German prisoners who considered them racial inferiors despite the Axis alliance. The sheer logistics of this operation represented an achievement that would have been impossible for Nazi Germany to replicate. The US military constructed these camps, complete with barracks, mess halls, hospitals, and recreational facilities in a matter of months, while simultaneously building the ships, planes, and weapons to fight a two-ocean war, a demonstration of surplus capacity that the Germans found incomprehensible given that their own nation was desperately converting every resource to military production and still falling short. But the real psychological impact came not from the camps themselves, which were Spartan but adequate, but from what the prisoners saw when they were transported through American cities and countryside to reach these camps, and later when they were assigned to work details that took them into the heart of American agriculture and industry. Franz von Papen Jr., son of Hitler's vice-chancellor, captured as a cavalry officer in Tunisia, described his train journey from the port of Norfolk, Virginia to Camp Forest, Tennessee in his diary entry dated June 12, 1943, recently translated and published by the German War Prisoners Historical Association. We traveled for 2 full days through this country, and what I saw has shaken me more than any artillery barrage in North Africa. There was no end to it, mile after mile of farmland with machinery so enormous it looked like something from a Fritz Lang film, and then cities, so many cities, each one blazing with electric lights even though they're supposedly at war, lights everywhere, in every window, street lights, advertising signs, as if they had forgotten that enemy aircraft might come, or more disturbing, as if they simply didn't care because they knew no enemy could ever reach them here, and I realized for the first time that perhaps we were the ones living in darkness. This reaction, shock at American abundance, specifically the abundance of light, appeared again and again in prisoner accounts because these men came from a Germany that had been under strict blackout regulations since 1939, where every window was covered, where streetlights were extinguished, where even striking a match outdoors could result in arrest by air raid wardens, and where the darkness was so complete that civilian deaths from blackout-related accidents exceeded bombing casualties in many cities during the early war years. To travel through American cities at night, seeing not just lights but wasteful, extravagant displays of illumination, neon signs advertising Coca-Cola and Chevrolet, movie theater marquees blazing with hundreds of bulbs, house windows glowing warmly without even a curtain to shield them, communicated a message more powerful than any propaganda. America was so secure, so far beyond the reach of German military power, that it didn't even bother to turn off the lights. Arnold Kramer, the historian whose 1979 book Nazi Prisoners of War in America remains the definitive academic work on the subject, interviewed over 300 former POWs in the 1970s and found this theme recurring constantly. They spoke about the lights more than anything else, not the food, not the treatment, but the lights, because the lights represented something psychological, a kind of casual invulnerability that broke their belief in German military supremacy. But if the lights planted seeds of doubt, it was America's industrial capacity that grew those seeds into full-blown ideological crisis. The prisoners assigned to work details at American factories encountered production scales that seemed to violate the laws of physics as they understood them. At the Willow Run plant outside Detroit, where Ford had constructed the largest room under one roof in the world at that time, a building so enormous that it created its own weather patterns inside, with clouds forming near the ceiling on humid days, German POWs working as janitors and manual laborers watched in stunned silence as a B-24 Liberator bomber rolled off the assembly line every 63 minutes at the plant's peak production in 1944, meaning that in the time it took them to eat lunch, another 4-engine heavy bomber capable of reaching Berlin and back was completed, and in a single 24-hour period, Willow Run produced more heavy bombers than Germany's entire aircraft industry could manufacture in a week. Heinz Janssen, a Luftwaffe mechanic who had serviced Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters before being captured in North Africa, he had been assigned to a ground unit after being wounded, worked at a Ford plant in Michigan and later told interviewers, "I had studied engineering at technical school in Stuttgart before the war, so I understood manufacturing, or I thought I did, but what I saw at Ford was not manufacturing as I knew it. It was something else, some kind of industrial philosophy we had never conceived of in Germany, where they had broken down every action into its smallest component and created specialized machines for each step. And the workers, who I had been told were semi-literate immigrants, operated these machines with such precision and at such speed that I had to recalculate my assumptions about American capability. And then I learned that Ford had multiple plants like this, and General Motors had plants even larger, and there were hundreds of other factories I would never see, and I realized that we had gone to war with a nation that could bury us in material without even straining its economy. Because all of this production, this overwhelming abundance of war machines, represented only a fraction of America's industrial capacity, maybe 30 or 40% they told us, while Germany had converted nearly everything to war production and still couldn't match it. This realization that America was fighting a multi-front global war as a secondary priority while still maintaining the world's highest civilian standard of living proved psychologically devastating to men who had been told that Germany's total mobilization and sacrifice represented the only path to victory. The cognitive dissonance intensified when prisoners were assigned to agricultural work details, which employed roughly 200,000 POWs at various times during the war, making them a significant component of American agricultural labor during a period when millions of American farm workers had been drafted or had moved to higher-paying factory jobs. A German prisoner arriving at a typical Midwestern farm in 1944 would have expected to find something comparable to a German agricultural operation. Perhaps 20 to 50 acres worked by a family and maybe a few hired hands using horse-drawn equipment, because that was the standard German farming model, with German agriculture still heavily reliant on animal power and human labor well into the 1940s. Instead, they encountered operations that defied their understanding of what a farm could be. 2,000-acre properties in Kansas and Nebraska worked by a single family using tractors so powerful that one machine could pull a 12-bottom plow, turning over more earth in a day than a German farmer could plow in an entire season, with combines that could harvest wheat at a rate that would have required hundreds of workers using traditional methods. Rolf Dietrich, who worked on a wheat farm near Concordia, Kansas from June 1944 through September 1945, wrote in a letter to his family that was intercepted by camp censors. All prisoner mail was read by military intelligence, providing a treasure trove of documentary evidence about POW psychology. Father, you must prepare yourself for a shock when I tell you what I have learned about American agriculture. The farm where I am working is larger than our entire village's combined farmland, and it is worked by one man, his wife, and his 2 teenage children, along with us prisoners, and they have machinery that seems like something from the future, tractors with rubber tires as tall as a man, that pull multiple plows simultaneously, and a harvesting machine that cuts, threshes, and bags the wheat in a single pass, and the yield per hectare is higher than anything we achieve in Westphalia, and this is considered an average farm, not even a particularly large or successful one. Military intelligence officers noticed that letters from prisoners working in agricultural settings showed significantly higher rates of ideological wavering than letters from prisoners kept in camps without work details, suggesting that direct exposure to American economic reality was more effective at undermining Nazi beliefs than any formal education program. The food itself became another vector of psychological transformation, though not in the way one might expect. It wasn't that the prisoners were being fed gourmet meals, but rather that they were fed the same standard rations as American soldiers, which by Nazi German standards seemed almost obscenely abundant. The daily POW ration, mandated by the Geneva Convention and the U.S. Army's commitment to reciprocal treatment, included meat at nearly every meal, approximately 12 ounces per day, fresh vegetables, white bread made from refined flour, butter, milk, and coffee, totaling about 4,000 calories daily, and prisoners could supplement this with items purchased from camp canteens using their work wages: cigarettes, candy bars, Coca-Cola, magazines, toiletries, creating a standard of living that exceeded what many of them had experienced as civilians in Depression-era Germany, and certainly exceeded anything they had known during wartime rationing. Hans Werner Richter, who would become one of post-war Germany's most important literary figures as founder of the influential Gruppe 47. Writers Collective, spent time in a POW camp in New York and later wrote about the profound psychological impact of abundance. We were fed better as prisoners in America than we had been fed as soldiers in the Wehrmacht, and certainly better than our families were being fed in Germany under the rationing system, and this created a strange guilt but also a realization. If America could feed its prisoners so well while fighting a global war, what did that say about the Nazi claims of encirclement and resource scarcity that had justified so much of Hitler's expansion? The abundance we experienced as prisoners gave the lie to everything we had been told about the necessity of Lebensraum, about Germany's desperate need for territory to feed its people, because here was a nation feeding millions of soldiers, supplying its allies, and still feeding its prisoners better than Germany fed its own citizens. The psychological impact of this abundance was amplified by the humanity with which many prisoners were treated by ordinary Americans, creating a moral contradiction that many found impossible to resolve within their Nazi ideological framework. Wehrmacht soldiers had been indoctrinated with the belief that Americans, as a mongrel race corrupted by Jewish influence and Negro genetics, would treat prisoners with cruelty, and they had been warned specifically about the supposedly savage nature of African American soldiers, whom they expected to torture and murder German captives, a propaganda line that was designed to stiffen resistance on the battlefield by making surrender seem like certain death. The reality they encountered proved so different from these expectations that it forced a fundamental reconsideration of everything they had been taught. African American soldiers, who comprised a significant portion of the guards at many POW camps, particularly in the South, treated German prisoners with professional correctness and sometimes even friendliness, despite the prisoners' often openly racist attitudes, and more than one former POW later recounted the shame of being treated with dignity by Black American guards while harboring Nazi beliefs about racial hierarchy, creating a cognitive dissonance that ate away at their ideological certainty. Prisoners assigned to work on farms or in small-town businesses often developed personal relationships with American civilians that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had told them. They met prosperous Jewish shop owners who treated them fairly, worked alongside Mexican-American farmhands who shared their lunches, encountered German-American families who spoke German and treated them with kindness while simultaneously having sons fighting against Germany overseas, and experienced a social complexity that the Nazi racial framework simply could not explain. Albert Blythe, a sergeant in the 101st Airborne whose story was later featured in Stephen Ambrose's Band of Brothers, wrote in a letter to his wife about guarding German prisoners in 1944, "They seem surprised that we don't beat them or starve them. I guess they expected us to act like they acted, and you can see it changing them, like they're reassessing everything they thought they knew, especially when we have Negro soldiers guarding them and treating them decent, which really seems to mess with their heads." The camp education programs, which became more formalized and extensive as the war progressed, particularly after the Provost Marshal General's office established the Special Projects Division in late 1944 specifically to accelerate the re-education process, built upon the psychological foundation that simple exposure to American life had already created, rather than attempting to force-feed democracy to hostile prisoners. The most successful programs, developed under the guidance of Major Edward Davison, a British-born poet and literary scholar who had become an American citizen, and heavily influenced by the Frankfurt School intellectuals who had fled Nazi Germany and now worked as consultants for American military intelligence, used subtle psychological techniques rather than overt propaganda. They screened carefully selected films that showed American democratic processes without explicit editorializing, provided access to uncensored German-language newspapers published in America that reported honestly about the war's progress and Germany's deteriorating situation, established camp libraries with books banned in Nazi Germany including works by Jewish authors and democratic philosophers, and most effectively, encouraged prisoners to create their own newspapers, theatrical productions, and educational programs, which allowed democratic ideas to emerge organically from the prisoner community itself rather than being imposed by American authorities. The results of this approach became apparent in the camp newspapers that prisoners published. By late 1944, publications like Der Ruf, The Call, produced by intellectual prisoners at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, were printing articles that openly criticized Nazi ideology, discussed the moral responsibility of Germans for the regime's crimes, and advocated for a democratic post-war Germany, and these newspapers circulated among the camps, spreading ideas that would have been unthinkable to these same men when they first arrived as prisoners. The most remarkable evidence of this psychological transformation came from the security reports that tracked attempted escapes and pro-Nazi activity within the camps. Despite housing over 370,000 prisoners across more than 500 camps over a 3-year period, there were fewer than 2,000 attempted escapes, about 0.5% of the prisoner population, with most of those occurring in the early period before the reality of Germany's military situation became undeniable, and the vast majority of escape attempts were not ideologically motivated dashes for freedom, but rather short-term absences by prisoners who wanted to visit nearby towns, meet women, or simply experience unsupervised freedom for a few hours before voluntarily returning to camp. This extraordinarily low escape rate, especially when compared to the 35,000 Allied prisoners who escaped or attempted to escape from German POW camps during the same period, reflected not just the geographic isolation of America, where would they escape to, but more fundamentally, a gradual acceptance that captivity in America was preferable to freedom in Nazi Germany, especially as reports from home described increasingly desperate conditions, Allied bombing campaigns that had reduced German cities to rubble, and a war situation that grew more hopeless with each passing month. George Gartner, a German prisoner who did successfully escape from Camp Deming, New Mexico in September 1945 and managed to evade capture for 40 years by assuming various American identities, later explained in his memoir Hitler's Last Soldier in America that his escape had nothing to do with loyalty to Nazi ideology, which he had abandoned during his captivity, and everything to do with his desire to remain in America permanently rather than be repatriated to what he expected would be a destroyed and occupied Germany. A paradoxical situation where a German POWs escape was actually motivated by his preference for American life over returning home. The security reports also tracked pro-Nazi violence within the camps, which did occur, particularly in the early years when hardcore Nazi true believers attempted to enforce ideological discipline among their fellow prisoners through intimidation and violence, with the most notorious incident occurring at Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma in November 1943, when German POWs murdered Corporal Johannes Kunz, a fellow prisoner suspected of being an informer, beating him to death and hanging his body from a rafter as a warning to others, a crime that resulted in 5 prisoners being tried, convicted, and hanged for murder at Fort Leavenworth in July 1945. But military intelligence reports documented a steady decline in these incidents as the war progressed, with camp commanders reporting that by 1945, openly pro-Nazi prisoners had become isolated minorities in most camps, shunned by the majority of prisoners who had grown tired of Nazi fanaticism and were more concerned with surviving the war, learning skills that would help them in the post-war period, and maintaining the relatively comfortable existence they had found in American captivity. The interaction between German prisoners and American civilians, particularly in rural areas where labor shortages had made POW workers essential to agricultural production, created thousands of personal connections that humanized the enemy on both sides and accelerated the prisoners' ideological transformation. American farmers, initially skeptical about working with Nazi soldiers, discovered that most of the German prisoners were not fanatical ideologues but rather ordinary men who had been conscripted into military service, who worked hard, appreciated fair treatment, and were as eager for the war to end as anyone else, and many of these working relationships evolved into genuine friendships, with farmers inviting prisoners into their homes for meals, allowing them to listen to family radios, and treating them as hired hands rather than enemy combatants, interactions that violated official regulations but were so common that military authorities largely overlooked them. There are numerous documented cases of American families maintaining correspondence with former POWs for decades after the war, inviting them to return for visits, and helping them immigrate to the United States permanently, relationships that began with a German prisoner picking corn or harvesting sugar beets alongside an American farmer and evolved into lifelong friendships that transcended the wartime enmity. Edward Pluth, a historian who studied POW labor in Minnesota, found that approximately 15% of German POWs assigned to Minnesota farms maintained some form of contact with their former employers after the war, with several dozen eventually immigrating to Minnesota and becoming permanent residents, choosing to live in America rather than remain in Germany, a stunning reversal for men who had once been Hitler's soldiers. The children who interacted with German prisoners often remembered these encounters with particular vividness, describing how the prisoners taught them German songs, carved wooden toys, and told them stories about Germany, creating cultural exchanges that broke down the dehumanizing stereotypes that both sides had been taught. Marion Ewell, who was 8 years old when German POWs worked on her family's farm in Iowa, recalled 60 years later, "My father told me they were the enemy, dangerous men we had to watch carefully, but they didn't seem dangerous to me. They seemed sad and lonely and far from home, and one of them, Carl, who couldn't have been more than 20, showed me pictures of his little sister in Germany who was about my age, and he cried when he talked about her, and I realized that the war had hurt him too, that being in a war wasn't glorious or exciting like the movies made it seem, but just sad and terrible for everyone." These human connections, multiplied across thousands of farms and communities across America, created a vast, informal diplomacy that prepared the ground for post-war German-American reconciliation in ways that formal diplomatic efforts could never have achieved, because they established at the personal level that Americans and Germans could live together peacefully, could work together productively, and could even like and respect each other despite having recently been mortal enemies. The repatriation process that began in earnest in 1946 and continued through 1947 revealed just how complete the psychological transformation had been for many prisoners. Military psychologists conducting exit interviews found that approximately 74% of repatriated prisoners expressed positive views about American democracy and American society, with about 39% expressing a desire to return to America as immigrants once conditions permitted, figures that represented a remarkable shift from the hostile, ideologically committed prisoners who had arrived 3 years earlier. The prisoners returning to Germany carried with them not just memories of American abundance, but also skills, knowledge, and most importantly, a democratic worldview that would prove crucial in rebuilding West Germany as a democratic nation integrated into the Western Alliance. Many former POWs had taken advantage of educational programs in the camps to learn English, study American business practices, and acquire technical skills, and they returned to Germany as a cohort of men who had witnessed a functioning democracy firsthand, understood how market economics operated at scale, and could testify from personal experience that the Nazi propaganda about America had been a comprehensive lie. Walter Hallstein, who had been captured by American forces and spent time in a POW camp in Mississippi, though he was an officer and experienced somewhat different conditions than enlisted men, later became the first president of the European Commission from 1958 to 1967, where he worked to create exactly the kind of peaceful, democratic, economically integrated Europe that Hitler had sought to prevent. And while the direct influence of his POW experience on his later political philosophy is difficult to quantify precisely, he himself acknowledged in interviews that his time in American captivity had exposed him to democratic ideas and American political culture in ways that shaped his conviction that Germany's future lay in democratic governance and European integration rather than nationalist isolation. The broader impact of the POW program on German-American relations and post-war German development becomes clearer when examined in the context of what didn't happen. Unlike after World War I, when German veterans returned home nursing grievances about harsh treatment and promoting the stab-in-the-back legend that blamed civilian politicians for military defeat, the German POWs who returned from America generally reported that they had been treated fairly, had witnessed American strength firsthand, and could not sustain the belief that Germany had been defeated by conspiracy or betrayal rather than by legitimate military and industrial superiority, making them resistant to neo-Nazi propaganda and available for recruitment into democratic political movements. The contrast between the American treatment of German POWs and the Soviet treatment of German prisoners on the Eastern Front, where approximately 1/3 of the 3 million German POWs captured by the Soviets died in captivity from starvation, exposure, disease, and forced labor, with the survivors not fully repatriated until 1956, could not have been more stark, and this contrast profoundly influenced West German political development by making alignment with the Western democracies seem not just strategically wise but morally necessary, because West Germans understood from the testimony of returned POWs that the Western Allies had treated defeated enemies with a humanity that the Soviet Union had not extended, creating a reservoir of pro-American sentiment that would sustain the Atlantic Alliance through the Cold War. Historians examining declassified documents from the post-war period have found evidence that American policymakers understood and deliberately leveraged the POW program's success in creating pro-American sentiment among former German soldiers. A 1947 State Department memorandum discussing Germany's political future explicitly noted that the approximately 370,000 German POWs who experienced American life during their captivity represent a valuable asset for democratic reconstruction, as they can testify from personal experience to the viability and prosperity of democratic capitalism, countering Soviet propaganda about Western decadence and American imperialism. And American occupation authorities in Germany actively sought out former POWs, who had been held in America to serve as community leaders, school administrators, and political organizers, recognizing that these men had already been informally vetted through their exposure to American democracy and their demonstrated willingness to abandon Nazi ideology. The long-term success of this strategy became apparent in the biographical data of West German political and business leaders in the 1950s and 1960s. A disproportionate number of them had spent time as American POWs, including figures like Heinrich Nordhoff, who became CEO of Volkswagen and transformed it into an international success story by applying American mass production techniques he had observed during his time in the United States, and Alfred Topfer, who founded one of Germany's most important cultural foundations and maintained throughout his life that his exposure to American culture during his POW years had been transformative in turning him away from nationalism toward internationalism and democratic values. The POW experience also influenced German economic policy in subtle but significant ways. The social market economy that Ludwig Erhard developed as the foundation of West German prosperity bore marked similarities to the American capitalist model that German POWs had witnessed, with its combination of market freedom, social protections, and anti-cartel regulation reflecting a hybrid approach that owed something to German Christian democratic thought but also incorporated lessons from American economic practice. Today, more than 75 years after the last German POWs were repatriated from America, the physical traces of the camp system have largely disappeared. Most of the 511 camps were temporary structures that were demolished or repurposed after the war, and only a handful of sites maintain any interpretive facilities or markers acknowledging their wartime function, making this one of the least commemorated aspects of America's World War II experience despite its significance. But the human legacy of the program persists in the thousands of German-American families that trace their origins to a chance meeting between a POW and an American civilian, in the democratic institutions of modern Germany that were built partly by men who learned about democracy while imprisoned in America, and in the broader pattern of post-war reconciliation that turned former enemies into close allies with remarkable speed and completeness. The contrast between World War II's aftermath, where former enemies became friends and allies within a generation, and World War I's aftermath, where the seeds of future conflict were sown by harsh treatment and perceived injustice, suggests that the American decision to treat German POWs with humanity and to expose them to American society rather than simply warehousing them until war's end represented a strategic choice whose dividends far exceeded its costs, proving that winning the peace sometimes matters more than winning the war, and that the most powerful weapon in ideological conflict is not propaganda but rather the undeniable evidence of a society that works, that prospers, and that treats even its enemies with a dignity that gives the lie to totalitarian claims about democratic weakness and decadence. The story of the 371,683 German POWs who experienced this transformation remains imperfectly known, partly because for decades it was overshadowed by more dramatic aspects of World War II history. The combat narratives, the Holocaust, the atomic bombings, the diplomatic conferences that shaped the post-war world, and partly because the participants themselves often felt ambivalent about discussing their experiences, with former POWs sometimes reluctant to admit how comfortable their captivity had been while their compatriots suffered through aerial bombardment and Soviet invasion, and American veterans sometimes uncomfortable acknowledging that they had befriended enemy soldiers. But as the generation that experienced these events passes away, historians have increasingly recognized the POW program as one of World War II's most successful but least celebrated achievements, a victory won not through superior firepower but through the simple power of example, proving that the most effective way to defeat a toxic ideology is not to suppress it by force but to expose it to a reality so compelling that it collapses under the weight of its own contradictions, which is precisely what happened when 371,683 German soldiers, expecting to find the weak and decadent America of Nazi propaganda, instead encountered an industrial colossus so powerful, so prosperous, and so demonstrably superior to anything the Third Reich had achieved that it broke their faith in Hitler's vision and opened them to the possibility that perhaps the Nazis had been wrong about everything, a realization that changed the course of their lives and, in a small but significant way, changed the course of history itself, making the German POW experience in America one of those rare historical moments when ordinary human decency and practical strategic wisdom aligned perfectly to produce an outcome that benefited everyone involved, transforming enemies into friends and proving that even in the midst of humanity's most destructive conflict, there was still room for the kind of basic respect and human recognition that makes reconciliation possible, a lesson that remains relevant today in a world still torn by ideological conflicts where both sides are convinced of the other's inherent evil and neither side can imagine the possibility of transformation. But the story of these German prisoners who arrived as Nazis and left as Democrats proves that people can change, that exposure to different ways of living can overcome years of indoctrination, and that the most powerful propaganda is not the kind that comes from government ministries but the kind that emerges from lived experience, from witnessing with your own eyes a society that embodies values you were taught to despise but that you cannot help but admire once you encounter them honestly, which is ultimately what happened to these German soldiers who came to America as prisoners of war and left as advocates for democracy, carrying back to Germany not just memories of abundance and fair treatment but a fundamental conviction that a different way of organizing society was possible. A conviction that would help rebuild Germany as a democratic nation and heal the wounds that war had opened, making the POW camps where this transformation occurred not prisons but rather classrooms where 371,683 students learned the most important lesson of the 20th century. That democracy, for all its messy imperfections, works better than dictatorship, that prosperity built on freedom exceeds wealth built on conquest, and that treating people with dignity, even when they are your enemies, sometimes wins more lasting victories than any military campaign ever could, which is why this forgotten story of German POWs in America deserves to be remembered not as a footnote to World War II but as one of its central achievements, a testament to the possibility of redemption and reconciliation even in history's darkest moments.